There's a specific way frost forms on pine needles when something massive has passed through recently. The branches don't just bend, they release moisture in patterns that crystallize differently depending on disturbance type. Bears leave chaotic frost disruption. Deer create delicate scattered patterns. What I tracked for 22 years left symmetrical displacement radiating from a central compression point, suggesting bipedal movement with stride length exceeding 6 feet. My name is Dr. James Whitaker. For 2 decades, I documented a single individual, a female canid of undetermined species, as she moved through a 180,000 square mile territory spanning Michigan's Upper Peninsula, northern Wisconsin, and northeastern Minnesota. She crossed state lines with apparent understanding of jurisdictional boundaries. She avoided population centers with tactical precision, and she maintained movement patterns that suggested not random wandering, but deliberate migration following resources only she seemed to recognize. I cataloged 287 separate encounters across 22 years, documented her transition from young adult to maturity to early decline, watched her establish territories, abandon them when human pressure increased, and relocate to increasingly remote habitat. I became the world's foremost expert on a subject the world insisted didn't exist. And then, on October 18, 2024, I was stopped at a federal checkpoint on Highway 2, 15 miles west of Iron River, Michigan. The agent was polite but firm. "Dr. Whitaker, this route is temporarily closed for infrastructure assessment. You'll need to detour south through Watersmeet." The detour added 40 miles. More significantly, it routed me completely away from Zone 12, the primary corridor she'd used for seasonal migration for the past 8 years. When I returned 3 days later, the checkpoint was permanent. Chain-link fencing extended into the forest on both sides. Warning signs cited ecological sensitivity area, no public access. And my research permits, valid through 2026 across 3 states, had been administratively suspended pending federal review of sensitive habitat protocols. I'd been cut off, deliberately, systematically, by agencies that officially didn't know what I was tracking but somehow knew exactly where she moved and when. Someone else had been watching, not just her, me, for years, and they'd decided my research was over. This is the story of 22 years tracking something that shouldn't exist, the patterns that emerged suggesting intelligence beyond any known species, and the moment I realized I was never the only one conducting surveillance. Someone had been studying the student, and they'd just closed the laboratory. The tracking began by accident in November 2002. I was a wildlife biologist with the Michigan DNR, conducting routine wolf population surveys in the Upper Peninsula. Standard protocol, GPS collar data analysis, scat collection, pack territory mapping. The work was methodical and, I'll admit, somewhat monotonous. Wolves are fascinating, but after 5 years of studying them, the patterns become predictable. Then I found tracks that weren't wolves. Gogebic County, roughly 8 miles south of Lake Superior, in terrain so remote the logging roads hadn't been maintained in decades. Fresh snow, maybe 6 inches, providing perfect casting medium. And there, crossing a frozen creek bed, were prints that made me stop walking and question everything I thought I knew about North American canids. 19 inches long, 8 inches wide at the ball, 5 distinct toe impressions with claw marks extending 2 inches beyond the digit pads. The stride length was approximately 73 inches, measured carefully, triple-checked, photographed with scale references. No wolf makes tracks like that. The largest gray wolves, males in their prime, leave prints around 5 inches long with stride lengths rarely exceeding 40 inches. These were nearly 4 times the size. I followed the trail for 2 miles before losing it on rocky ground. But I'd documented enough. The gait pattern suggested bipedal movement with occasional transition to quadrupedal locomotion. The depth of impression indicated something weighing 400+ pounds. And most significantly, the trail showed purposeful direction. Not the meandering pattern of foraging, but focused travel toward a specific destination. I reported it as anomalous large canid tracks, possible hybrid or undocumented subspecies in my field notes. My supervisor dismissed it. Probably just overlapping wolf tracks in soft snow. Happens more than you'd think. But I knew better. Those weren't overlapping tracks. They were individual impressions from something massive and bipedal. I returned to the location 3 days later with better casting equipment. The tracks were still there, now partially degraded by wind and temperature fluctuations, but clear enough to make plaster casts. I created molds of the 3 best examples and stored them in my personal research archive, labeled simply, Unknown Canid, November 2002, Gogebic County. That should have been the end of it. An interesting anomaly. Something to mention at conferences as a curiosity. A mystery filed away with dozens of other unexplained field observations that accumulate over a career in wildlife biology. But I couldn't let it go. I started modifying my survey routes, expanded my coverage area beyond official wolf study zones, began hiking off-trail in areas with no management justification, following instinct more than protocol. I told my supervisor I was conducting comprehensive ecosystem baseline documentation. He approved without question. Budget allowed for expanded field time, and I had a reputation for thorough work. What I was actually doing, searching for more evidence of whatever had made those tracks. I found it in March 2003. Different location, Ontonagon County, roughly 40 miles west of the original sighting. Similar track pattern, but in mud near a tributary stream. Fresh, made within the last 12 hours based on water seepage into the impressions. And this time, I found something else. Scat. Large deposit approximately 8 inches long and 3 inches in diameter. Composition suggested carnivore diet, hair, bone fragments, partially digested tissue. I collected samples using sterile technique and submitted them to the state lab, again labeled vaguely as possible hybrid canid. Results came back 3 weeks later. DNA shows high similarity to Canis lupus, with anomalous markers suggesting either sample contamination or undocumented genetic variation. Recommend resampling for confirmation. I resampled twice more over the next year. Different locations, careful collection protocols, chain of custody documentation. Results were consistent. Canid DNA with structural markers that didn't match any known subspecies in the genetic database. I was tracking something real, something biological, something that left measurable, testable evidence, something that shouldn't exist. By 2005, I had documented 12 separate encounter sites across Michigan's Upper Peninsula. The pattern was clear. Whatever this was, it maintained a large territory, at least 30,000 square miles, and moved through that territory on what appeared to be seasonal rotation. Spring sightings concentrated in the eastern UP. Summer shifted west toward the Wisconsin border. Fall brought movement back east. Winter sightings were rare but suggested denning behavior in the most remote sections of the Ottawa National Forest. I began mapping the movements. GPS coordinates for every track find, every scat sample, every anomalous tree scoring that suggested something large had passed through. The map that emerged showed clear corridors, travel routes following ridgelines, river valleys, and areas with minimal human development. She was avoiding us, deliberately, intelligently. I started thinking of the subject as she in 2006, after finding what appeared to be birth remnants near a sheltered overhang in Marquette County. Placental tissue, small tracks suggesting juvenile presence, and adult prints showing the characteristic size and pattern I'd been tracking. The juvenile tracks disappeared after approximately 3 weeks. Either mortality or the young had moved beyond my survey range. Female, breeding capable, successfully raising offspring in territory we assumed was comprehensively documented. In 2007, I made my first attempt at visual confirmation. Set up trail cameras at 3 high-probability locations identified through track pattern analysis. Motion-activated, infrared-capable, weatherproof housings. I captured her on camera in September 2007. Partial image. She'd moved through the frame at an angle that kept most of her body outside sensor range, but what was visible confirmed everything the tracks had suggested. Massive shoulder, fur color, gray-brown with darker guard hairs along the spine, musculature suggesting incredible strength, movement that was clearly bipedal, upright posture, arms swinging naturally at her sides. The image quality was poor. Distance and angle made definitive analysis impossible, but I knew. I finally knew. I was tracking a living, breathing individual of a species science insisted was impossible, and she was magnificent. The tracking intensified after the 2007 photograph. What had been professional curiosity transformed into something closer to obsession. I requested and received approval for expanded field research funding. Pitched it as Comprehensive Predator Ecology Study, examining apex predator interactions across Upper Peninsula ecosystems. The DNR approved a 3-year grant. I used every dollar to fund equipment upgrades and extend my time in the field. By 2009, I had 43 trail cameras positioned across her known territory, solar-powered units with cellular data transmission. I could monitor from my office in Marquette, receiving near real-time alerts when cameras triggered. The data that emerged was extraordinary. She moved through her territory on a roughly 90-day rotation. Spring concentration in the eastern UP, Marquette, Alger, and Schoolcraft counties. Summer westward shift, Ontonagon, Gogebic, Iron counties. Autumn positioning near the Wisconsin border. Winter retreat to the most remote sections of the Ottawa and Hiawatha National Forests. But it wasn't random migration. She was following prey populations. Her movements correlated precisely with white-tailed deer seasonal patterns, elk reintroduction zones, and even beaver colony locations. She was hunting with sophisticated understanding of prey behavior and availability. More than that, she was avoiding humans with tactical precision. When recreation pressure increased in summer months, she shifted to areas with minimal trail access. When hunting season brought increased human presence, she relocated entirely, sometimes crossing 60-plus miles in a single night to avoid contact. This wasn't instinct. This was intelligence, problem-solving, strategic planning. In 2010, she crossed the state line. I tracked her via GPS collar data from a deer she'd killed. The deer had been part of a disease monitoring study and carried a functioning collar. The kill site was in Michigan, but the collar signal showed movement westward into Wisconsin, suggesting she'd dragged the kill across the border before consumption. This created jurisdictional complications. My research permits were Michigan-specific. Working in Wisconsin required different authorizations, different agencies, different bureaucratic frameworks. I applied for multi-state research permits in early 2011. Cited, highly mobile predator requiring cross-boundary monitoring. Wisconsin DNR approved after review. Minnesota followed 6 months later when tracking data showed she'd expanded her range even further west. By 2012, I had documented her in 3 states. Her territory had expanded to encompass nearly 180,000 square miles, the largest territory documented for any terrestrial predator in North America. She was maintaining this massive range alone, without pack support, suggesting capabilities far beyond known canid ecology. The academic challenges were mounting. I'd accumulated 8 years of data documenting something extraordinary, but I couldn't publish. Every attempt at writing formal research papers collapsed when I confronted the central problem. I was documenting a species that didn't officially exist. I submitted one paper in 2013 to the Journal of Mammalogy, Movement Ecology of a Large Unidentified Canid in the Upper Great Lakes region. Peer review destroyed it. Comments included: author provides no taxonomic classification for study subject. Without species identification, ecological interpretations are meaningless. Track measurements suggest impossibly large canid, more likely measurement error or misidentification of multiple overlapping tracks. DNA evidence is inconclusive and possibly contaminated. Recommend comprehensive resampling before making extraordinary claims. The paper was rejected. I never tried to publish again. Instead, I maintained private documentation, journals filled with behavioral observations, maps showing movement patterns, photographs cataloging her physical changes over years, a complete archive of one individual's life history, compiled with scientific rigor but shared with no one. She was aging. By 2015, I'd been tracking her for 13 years. Her movement patterns showed subtle changes, suggesting declining physical capacity, shorter travel distances between rest periods, increased time in areas with easier prey access, a slight but measurable decrease in territorial range. She was in her prime when I'd first found her tracks in 2002. By 2015, she was entering middle age, if canid longevity models applied at all to whatever she was. I wondered about her lifespan. Wolf longevity in the wild averages 6 to 8 years. Captive wolves sometimes reach 13 or 14, but she was clearly much older, showing none of the terminal decline typical of aged wolves. Was her species longer lived? Or was she simply exceptional, an individual who'd survived through some combination of intelligence, strength, and luck? In 2017, something changed. Her movement patterns shifted dramatically. She expanded westward into Minnesota's Boundary Waters region, territory she'd never occupied in 15 years of documentation. She remained there for nearly 8 months, far longer than any previous seasonal stay. When I finally accessed the area in September 2017, I found evidence of why, Another individual. Tracks. Different size. Smaller, roughly 16 inches long, but showing the same biomechanical characteristics. Same gait pattern. Same anatomical features suggesting bipedal canid. A male, I suspected, based on territorial marking behavior and track size comparisons with my primary subject. She hadn't been alone. For at least part of 2017, there had been 2 of them in proximity, possibly mating, possibly just temporary territory overlap. But the male was gone by October 2017. I never found evidence of him again. Either he'd moved beyond my monitoring range, or he'd died, or he'd been the wanderer, while she remained the territorial constant. I searched for juvenile evidence through 2018, found nothing definitive. Either there'd been no reproduction, or the offspring hadn't survived, or they'd dispersed beyond my detection capacity. She returned to her usual patterns in 2019, resumed the 90-day rotation through Michigan, Wisconsin, and western Minnesota. The brief expansion into the boundary waters appeared to have been an anomaly, or an attempt at something that hadn't succeeded. By 2020, I'd been tracking her for 18 years. The longest continuous documentation of any individual large predator in North American wildlife research history. I had 127,000 photographs across 287 separate encounters, genetic samples from 47 locations, behavioral data spanning nearly 2 decades of seasonal cycles. I had built the most comprehensive profile of an undocumented species ever compiled, and I couldn't share it with anyone, because the moment I did, everything would change. Her territory would become a research zone. Other scientists would flood the area. Federal agencies would implement management protocols. And she, this extraordinary individual who'd survived by avoiding us, would be transformed from free creature to managed specimen. I couldn't do that to her. Not after 18 years of watching her navigate a world that was increasingly hostile to anything large, wild, and rare. So I kept silent, and kept watching, and hoped that silence was protection enough. It wasn't. The federal presence began subtly in 2021. I started noticing aircraft, small planes, flying systematic grid patterns over portions of her territory, not commercial flights, not typical Forest Service surveys. These were deliberate, methodical aerial reconnaissance missions, focusing specifically on areas where I'd documented her highest activity. Then came the cameras. Not mine. Government installations. I'd find them positioned near my own equipment, newer models, more sophisticated, with federal property tags. Someone else was conducting surveillance. Someone with resources far beyond what my DNR grants provided. I reported it to my supervisor. There's federal equipment overlapping my research zones. Do we have interagency projects I'm not aware of? He made inquiries. Came back confused. No active federal projects listed for those coordinates. You sure it's government equipment? I was sure. The property tags were clear. USFWS. Authorized personnel only. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The agency responsible for endangered species management and protection. Why were they monitoring areas where officially nothing unusual existed? In April 2022, I was contacted directly, not by phone or email, by personal visit. 2 agents arrived at my office in Marquette, credentials identifying them as USFWS law enforcement. Dr. Whitaker, we'd like to discuss your research activities in the Upper Peninsula and Western Lake Superior regions. Of course. What specifically interests you? The older agent, Special Agent Reeves, pulled out a tablet showing one of my trail camera photographs. Clear image of her, taken in 2021, showing full body profile. This interests us. What can you tell us about this individual? I chose my words carefully. That's from my apex predator research, studying movement ecology and territorial dynamics. What species? Undetermined. Possibly Canis lupus variant, though the morphology is unusual. Unusual. Agent Reeves smiled without humor. Dr. Whitaker, we've been monitoring your research activities for approximately 3 years. We're aware of your documentation scope. We know you've been tracking this individual since 2002, and we know you're aware this is not a wolf. My stomach dropped. If you've been monitoring me, then you know what she is. We know what she might be. We're less certain about your intentions. 20 years of tracking without publication, without official reporting, without collaboration with appropriate federal authorities. That suggests either academic hoarding or deliberate concealment. I've been protecting her. Publication would bring attention that could harm her survival. That's not your decision to make. If this individual represents an undocumented species, particularly one meeting endangered species criteria, federal law requires reporting. Failure to report violates multiple statutes related to wildlife management and scientific integrity. Agent Reeves leaned forward. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to share your complete documentation with our office. All photographs, all tracking data, all genetic samples, all behavioral observations. You're going to cooperate fully with a federal assessment team. And you're going to cease independent research activities pending completion of that assessment. And if I refuse? Then we revoke your research permits, seize your equipment as evidence of regulatory violations, and pursue criminal charges for obstruction of federal wildlife management operations. Your choice. It wasn't really a choice. I turned over everything in May 2022. 20 years of documentation, delivered to a federal facility in Minneapolis under chain of custody protocols that suggested this was criminal evidence rather than scientific collaboration. Agent Reeves assured me, "This is protective. We're establishing federal management protocols to ensure her survival and assess whether there are others. Your documentation is invaluable. You should be proud." I felt like a traitor. The federal team moved fast. Within 3 months, I received notification, temporary area closure, ecological sensitivity assessment. The closure covered approximately 8,000 square miles across portions of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, areas corresponding exactly to her core territory and primary movement corridors. No public access, no exceptions. Even my research permits, which technically remained valid, were suspended pending federal review. I was locked out of the area I'd studied for 20 years, separated from the individual I'd tracked through her entire adult life. I tried making inquiries, called contacts at USFWS, reached out to colleagues who might have information. Everyone gave the same response. "Can't discuss ongoing federal assessments, sorry." In September 2022, I received a call from Agent Reeves. "Dr. Whitaker, we've completed preliminary assessment. I thought you'd want to know. We've confirmed your subject's continued presence in the closure zone. She's healthy. Movement patterns consistent with your historical documentation. Can I access the area? Observe from a distance? Negative. Federal protocols prohibit non-essential personnel during assessment phases. But I can tell you, your protection instincts were correct. What you've been tracking is significant. More significant than you probably realized." What does that mean? It means your 20 years of careful observation may have kept something extraordinary alive long enough for us to properly protect it. That's important work, Dr. Whitaker, even if it has to remain classified for now. Classified? For her protection, and for reasons related to ongoing federal assessments I'm not authorized to discuss. But thank you. Your documentation has been invaluable. The call ended. I was left with more questions than answers, and absolutely no ability to investigate further. I tried approaching the closure boundaries in October 2022, drove to Highway 2 near Iron River, planning to access the forest from secondary roads and hike into areas that technically remained outside the restricted zone but offered views into her territory. That's when I encountered the first checkpoint. Federal agents, chain link barriers, signage citing National Security Ecological Sensitivity Zone. National Security? For wildlife monitoring? Dr. Whitaker. The agent recognized me from my credentials. "This area is closed to all non-authorized personnel. No exceptions. I have valid research permits. Suspended permits. You'll need to turn around." I had no choice. The federal government had taken control of her territory, my research, and any possibility of continuing the work that had defined 2 decades of my life. I'd been tracking her for 20 years, and in a matter of months, I'd been completely shut out. Someone else was running the research now. Someone with authority I couldn't challenge and resources I couldn't match, and I had no idea what they were really doing in that closure zone, or what they'd already found. Exile feels strange when it's bureaucratic rather than physical. I could still live in Marquette, still maintained my office, still drew salary, but the work that mattered, 20 years of careful observation, relationship building with an extraordinary subject, was finished. I spent months trying to understand what was happening beyond the closure boundaries. Filed Freedom of Information Act requests, contacted congressional representatives, reached out to environmental advocacy groups. Every avenue hit the same wall. Information exempt under national security provisions related to ongoing federal operations. National security, for wildlife research. The classification made no sense unless Unless what I'd been tracking wasn't just a rare species. Unless there were implications beyond conservation biology. Unless someone at federal level had decided this was more than academic curiosity. I started investigating differently. If I couldn't access direct information, I'd gather peripheral data, track federal budget allocations, monitor personnel movements, look for patterns in what wasn't being said. In December 2022, I found something. A budget line item buried in Department of Defense appropriations. Northern Forest Research Initiative, $47 million, allocated to a joint USFWS-DoD program with classification preventing detailed disclosure. Department of Defense. Why was DoD funding wildlife research? I called Agent Reeves. He didn't answer. I left voicemail. Why is DoD involved? What aren't you telling me? He called back 3 hours later. Dr. Whitaker, I'm going to give you advice as someone who respects your work. Stop digging. This is beyond civilian research scope. Accept that protection is happening and be grateful she's surviving. Is she? Surviving? Or is she in a facility somewhere being studied? She's in her territory, free-ranging, monitored but not captured. That's all I can tell you. Then why DoD involvement? Silence. Then, because some discoveries have implications beyond wildlife management. That's all I'm authorized to say. Please, Dr. Whitaker, let this go. He hung up. I couldn't let it go. 20 years of investment. A relationship, however one-sided, with an extraordinary individual. I deserved to know what was happening. I drove to the closure boundary in January 2023. Different location this time. Western Wisconsin access point where I'd tracked her often in previous years. Hiked to the barrier fence in pre-dawn darkness. Brought telephoto camera equipment. The fence was serious. 12 feet high. Topped with razor wire. Motion sensors visible every 50 yards. This wasn't ecological protection. This was containment. I positioned myself on a ridge overlooking the closure zone, roughly 400 yards from the fence line. Legal position. Public land outside the restriction. I could observe without technically violating closure protocols. I watched for 6 hours. Saw 3 federal patrols, armed personnel in unmarked vehicles conducting perimeter checks. Saw helicopter overflights with sophisticated sensor equipment. Saw what looked like mobile command stations positioned at strategic intervals. This was military-grade security for what was supposedly wildlife research. At 11:34 hours, movement inside the fence line. Large, bipedal, moving through timber with characteristic gait I'd recognize anywhere. Her, still in her territory, still free-ranging as Reeves had claimed. But she was being followed. 3 personnel on foot maintaining distance carrying equipment I couldn't identify from 400 yards but which clearly wasn't standard wildlife monitoring gear. She stopped, turned toward them, held position for perhaps 30 seconds. They stopped, maintained distance, no aggressive posture, no attempt to approach closer. Then she moved on, and they followed, careful, measured, maintaining precisely the same distance I'd maintained during my own observations. They were using my protocols. My 20 years of behavioral research was informing how they approached her. They'd learned from my documentation how to observe without threatening. I felt simultaneously violated and relieved. Violated that my work was being used without my participation. Relieved that at least they were being careful. I photographed everything. Documented the security setup, the patrol patterns, the observation protocols. Then I left before the security patrols could detect my presence. Back home, I spent hours reviewing the images, trying to understand what I was seeing. The operation scale was enormous. Easily dozens of personnel, millions in equipment, security measures suggesting something far more significant than endangered species protection. What had they found? Just her? Or had they confirmed what I'd suspected but never proven? That she wasn't alone? That there were others? In March 2023, I received an unexpected visit. Dr. Catherine Morrison, evolutionary biologist from Johns Hopkins. She introduced herself in my office with credentials suggesting she was part of the federal assessment team. Dr. Whitaker, I've read your documentation, all of it. It's extraordinary work. 22 years of continuous observation. We've learned things from your behavioral notes that we never would have discovered on our own. Then why am I locked out? Because the scope has expanded. What you documented as a solitary individual is actually part of a population. Small, maybe 15 to 20 individuals across a territory spanning 4 states. But viable, breeding, surviving through exactly the adaptive behaviors you documented. My breath caught. 20 individuals? Approximately. Your female is the oldest we've documented. She's matriarch of sorts. Her movement patterns influence where others range. Protecting her means protecting the entire population. So why the military involvement? Why national security classification? Dr. Morrison was quiet for a moment. Because they're intelligent, Dr. Whitaker. Not animal intelligent. They communicate. They problem solve. They modify their environment intentionally. And they've demonstrated awareness of being observed and capacity to respond strategically. I know all this. I documented it for 20 years. You documented one individual's intelligence. We're documenting cultural transmission across a population, tool use, symbolic behavior, communication with grammatical structure. Dr. Whitaker, what you found isn't just a rare species. It's potentially a non-human sapient species, and that carries implications beyond wildlife management. The weight of what she was saying hit me gradually. Not just rare, not just intelligent, possibly people, by any definition that mattered. What happens now? I asked quietly. We protect them, study them minimally, document from distance, and keep the entire thing classified until we understand enough to make informed decisions about public disclosure, which might be years, decades, maybe never. And me? You did your part. You documented her existence. You protected her through careful observation. Now let us finish the work. Please. She left. I sat in my office for hours processing the revelation. I'd been tracking not just a creature but a person for 22 years. And now they were studying an entire culture I'd helped discover, but would never be allowed to fully understand. April 2023. I violated federal closure protocols. I couldn't stay away. 22 years of connection couldn't be severed by bureaucratic decree. I needed to see her one more time. Needed to know she was truly surviving. Needed confirmation that federal protection meant preservation, not exploitation. I accessed the closure zone from a section I'd mapped extensively during early research. A series of limestone caves creating natural passages beneath the ridgelines. The caves weren't marked on official topographic maps. I'd discovered them in 2009 and documented them only in private journals. If federal security was based on my official documentation, they wouldn't know about this access point. I entered the cave system at 300 hours, using night vision to navigate the underground passages. Emerged inside the closure boundary approximately 2 miles from the nearest patrol route. Pre-dawn darkness provided cover as I moved toward areas where I'd historically documented her seasonal presence. I found her at 5:47 hours, just as dawn light began filtering through the canopy. She was in a small clearing I'd photographed dozens of times over 20 years. The same fallen log where I'd observed her resting in 2011, 2015, 2019. Her territory had constants, places she returned to across decades because they offered something important: security, familiarity, peace. She was sleeping, or appeared to be, lying on her side, breathing steady, completely relaxed in posture that suggested she felt safe. I stayed motionless 60 yards away, downwind, watching through telephoto lens, not photographing, not documenting, just being present, sharing space one final time. She woke at 06:03, stood, stretched in a manner so human it sent chills through me. Then she turned and looked directly at where I was positioned. 22 years. She knew, had always known when I was near, had tolerated my presence the same way the federal team was now tolerating it, assessing me as non-threatening and allowing proximity within boundaries she controlled. We looked at each other across the clearing, dawn light catching her fur, her eyes, amber brown, intelligent, meeting mine without fear or aggression, just recognition. I nodded. Acknowledgement. Goodbye. Thank you for 22 years of allowing me into your world. She made a sound, low, brief, the vocalization I'd recorded hundreds of times but never fully understood. Now I thought I did. It wasn't threat. It was communication. Response to my gesture with one of her own. Then she turned and walked into the forest. Unhurried. Confident. Disappearing into timber she knew better than any human ever would. I stayed in that clearing for another hour, crying, grieving something I hadn't fully lost but knew I'd never have again. The relationship, however one-sided I'd thought it was, had been mutual. She'd allowed me to observe because I'd respected boundaries, had stayed at distance, had been careful, and now others were being careful too, using methods I'd developed, protecting her through protocols I'd refined over decades. I'd taught them how to coexist with her, and in doing so, I'd made myself obsolete. I was arrested leaving the cave system at 0847 hours. Federal agents waiting at the exit. They'd known about the caves, had monitored them, had allowed me to enter because, I learned later, they wanted to see if I'd approach her, wanted to assess whether I'd maintain distance protocols or attempt closer contact that might distress her. I'd maintained distance, even in violation. Even knowing it might be my last chance, I'd respected her boundaries one final time. Agent Reeves was there. Dr. Whitaker, you're under arrest for violating federal closure protocols. But before we process that, thank you. For what? For showing us you meant what you wrote in your notes. That protection requires distance. That observation can be respectful. You could have approached her, touched her, gotten the close contact most researchers would kill for. But you didn't. You stayed back, even when you thought no one was watching. She's not a specimen. She's a person. You don't invade people's space without permission. Exactly. And that's why we're going to handle your arrest differently than protocol suggests. They released me 6 hours later. No charges filed, but conditions imposed. Permanent restriction from the closure zone. Surrender of all unpublished documentation and private notes. Agreement to maintain confidentiality about the federal operation. I signed everything. What choice did I have? But Reeves gave me something in return. A tablet showing real-time monitoring data. We can't give you access, but we can let you watch. Remote observation. You can see she's healthy. See the population is stable. See that your 22 years achieved what you wanted. Her protection. The tablet showed camera feeds from multiple angles. Her clearing. The den sites I'd documented. Movement corridors I'd mapped. All under observation by equipment so sophisticated, mine looked primitive by comparison. And there, multiple individuals. Adults, juveniles, elders. Moving through territory with clear coordination. Communicating with vocalizations showing grammatical structure. Using tools. Teaching young. Everything I'd suspected. Everything I'd hoped to prove but couldn't. Confirmed. There's about 18 individuals total, Reeves said quietly. Your female is eldest. She's teaching the others. We've documented knowledge transmission about humans, about territory management, about seasonal patterns. Dr. Morrison was right. This is culture, and your subject is the culture keeper. Why show me this? Because you earned it. 22 years of protection without recognition. You deserve to know it worked. She's alive. They're surviving. And it's because you were patient. I left federal custody that evening with the tablet and a monitoring account allowing remote observation access. Limited feeds, no audio, no ability to control cameras, but visual confirmation that the population persisted. It wasn't the same as being there, but it was enough to know she was safe. I watched the feeds daily, see her moving through territory she's known for decades, see younger individuals following her, learning from her, carrying forward behaviors she's refined through a lifetime of avoiding humans while occupying human-adjacent habitat. She's approximately 26 years old now. I've tracked her from young adult through prime into early elder status. If canid longevity models apply at all, she might have 5 more years, maybe 10 if she's exceptional. And when she dies, someone will be watching. Someone will document her final days. Someone will understand the significance of losing the eldest member of a population so small that every individual matters. It won't be me, but I taught them how to watch respectfully, how to observe without disrupting, how to see personhood in something that looks like animal but thinks like us. That's my legacy. Not publications, not academic recognition, but careful observation passed forward to others who will continue the work. Sometimes protection means stepping back, means letting others take over, means accepting that your role was always temporary, bridging between her world and ours until proper frameworks existed. I was the bridge. Now I'm just the witness to what comes after, and that's enough. The closure became permanent in August 2023. Federal designation, critical habitat, non-human sapient species protection zone, the first such designation in U.S. history. The area expanded to encompass 47,000 square miles across Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. Basically the entire range I'd documented plus extensive buffer zones. No public access, no exceptions. Federal enforcement with criminal penalties for violation. The most restrictive habitat protection ever implemented in the continental United States. The designation required public announcement. You can't close 47,000 square miles without explaining why. But the announcement was carefully worded. Federal agencies have documented presence of a rare and potentially sapient species requiring maximum protection. Details remain classified pending ongoing assessment. Public cooperation with access restrictions is mandatory. Rare and potentially sapient. Enough information to justify the closure. Not enough to spark mass curiosity or cryptozoology enthusiasm. The media reaction was predictable. Speculation about what species could require such extreme protection. Cryptozoology communities immediately assumed Bigfoot charn Sasquatch confirmation. Mainstream media treated it skeptically. Rare species protection doesn't usually involve Department of Defense. But without photographs, without concrete details, the story faded within 2 weeks. Just another government land closure among thousands. Public attention moved on. Perfect outcome. Maximum protection through minimum disclosure. I was interviewed once in September 2023. Dr. Morrison visited my office with a proposal. We'd like to document your methodology. 22 years of observational protocols that minimize disruption while gathering comprehensive data. That's valuable. Other researchers working with sensitive species could learn from your approach. You want me to publish? With restrictions. No location data. No photographs identifying the species. Focus purely on methodological framework. How to observe potentially sapient species without causing stress or behavioral modification. I agreed. Spent 3 months writing a paper titled Long-Term Non-Invasive Monitoring of Rare Megafauna. Protocols for Distance Observation and Ethical Boundaries. Published in Conservation Biology in January 2024. My first and only publication from 22 years of work. It was well received. Requests for interviews came from researchers working with gorillas, orangutans, elephants, species where observer effect and ethical boundaries were constant challenges. My protocols became cited methodology for minimally invasive observation, professional recognition finally, not for discovering her but for respecting her, for developing methods that prioritized subject welfare over researcher curiosity. It felt appropriate. The work was never about me. It was always about her. In March 2024, I received access expansion. Not physical access, the closure remained absolute, but enhanced monitoring privileges, multiple camera feeds, audio access, movement tracking data showing the entire population's seasonal patterns. You're consulting now, Reeves explained. Behavioral analysis. The team needs someone who understands long-term patterns. You're the only human who's observed her across 20-plus years. That historical context is irreplaceable. I became a remote consultant, analyzing behavior, identifying pattern changes, flagging potential stressors, advising on how to modify monitoring protocols to minimize disruption. It wasn't fieldwork, but it was contribution. And I could see in real time that she was thriving. The population was stable. Juveniles were surviving to adulthood. The protection framework was working. Not everyone was satisfied with the closure. Land use conflicts emerged quickly. Logging companies lost access to permitted harvest areas. Recreation groups protested trail closures. Local economies dependent on tourism complained about lost revenue. Congressional hearings happened in May 2024. Testimony from multiple stakeholders demanding justification for the closure, or at minimum modification allowing limited public access. Dr. Morrison testified. Her statement was careful. The species in question demonstrates cognitive capabilities suggesting sapience. Introducing public access would constitute harassment of potentially sentient beings. The ethical framework preventing harassment of persons applies here, regardless of species classification. Until we understand more, maximum protection is the only defensible position. The word persons was deliberate, suggesting without stating that we were protecting not animals, but individuals with rights approaching human equivalent status. The hearings ended with the closure maintained. But the controversy didn't fade. Online communities formed demanding transparency. Conspiracy theories flourished. Everything from alien contact to government super soldier programs. The truth was simultaneously more mundane and more extraordinary. We'd found intelligent non-humans in our own forests, and we were protecting them by keeping humans out. In July 2024, something unexpected happened. A video leaked. Someone, we never determined who, released 30 seconds of footage showing multiple individuals engaged in what appeared to be tool construction. One adult teaching two juveniles how to modify branches for a purpose the footage didn't show long enough to determine. The video quality was poor, clearly taken from extreme distance with digital zoom producing pixelation, but it was clear enough to show bipedal canids, manipulating objects, teaching, learning. The video went viral. Millions of views within 48 hours. Every news outlet covering it. Cryptozoology communities treating it as vindication. Scientific community demanding access for peer-reviewed study. The federal response was swift. We do not confirm or deny the authenticity of leaked footage. The critical habitat protection zone closure remains in effect. Federal law prohibits harassment of potentially sapient species. Violations will be prosecuted. No confirmation, no denial. Just reinforcement of the closure and legal consequences for violation. The controversy raged for weeks, then gradually faded. Without new information, without access, without official confirmation beyond vague statements, public attention drifted elsewhere. But the leak had consequences. Security expanded. The perimeter became even more restrictive. Federal enforcement more aggressive. They were taking no chances with additional exposures. I was questioned about the leak. Dr. Whitaker, the footage appears similar to your photographic style. Do you have knowledge of how this video became public? No, I haven't had physical access to the zone in over a year. All my observation is through official monitoring channels. They believed me. But the implicit message was clear. Even remote access was privilege. Maintain confidentiality or lose monitoring permissions. I maintained confidentiality. Because seeing her, even remotely, mattered more than vindication or public recognition. October 2024 brought the incident that ended everything. The federal checkpoint on Highway 2, the permanent closure of my route, the administrative suspension of even remote monitoring access. Something had changed. The federal posture shifted from protection to containment, and I was no longer considered trustworthy enough to even observe remotely. Agent Reeves wouldn't return calls. Dr. Morrison stopped responding to emails. My monitoring account was deactivated without explanation. I'd been cut off completely, not just from physical access, but from any knowledge of her status or survival. After 22 years of continuous observation, I was blind. November 2024. I made one final attempt. Not to access the closure zone physically. That was impossible now with enhanced security. But to understand why I'd been cut off. Why the dramatic shift from consultant to exile. What had changed that made even remote observation too much access. I drove to Minneapolis. Unannounced visit to the federal building housing the USFWS office managing the protection zone. Demanded meeting with Agent Reeves. They made me wait 6 hours. Then Reeves appeared, looking tired and older than I remembered. Dr. Whitaker, you shouldn't be here. I want to know why I've been locked out. 22 years. I earned the right to at least know she's alive. He gestured to a conference room. Closed the door. You were locked out because the situation has escalated beyond wildlife protection. That's all I can tell you. Not good enough? Escalated how? Reeves was silent for a long moment. Then, they made contact. My blood went cold. Contact. With us. Deliberate contact. They approached a monitoring station. Left. Something. Message, we think. Symbolic communication attempting to establish dialogue. The entire framework has shifted from observation to potential diplomatic relationship. And that's above my clearance level now. Above yours, definitely. They're trying to communicate? They've been communicating. We're only just now realizing it's intentional communication directed at us rather than internal communication we're observing. The stone arrangements you documented? We think some of them were meant for you. Responses to your presence. They knew you were watching. They chose to respond. I sat down heavily. 22 years. She'd known the entire time, had been communicating, and I'd never fully understood. So what happens now? I asked quietly. Now it becomes something other than wildlife management. First contact protocols, diplomatic frameworks, legal questions about whether they have rights, sovereignty, territorial claims. You're not qualified for that work. Neither am I. So we both get sidelined while people with appropriate expertise figure out what the hell we do. When we meet intelligent non-humans who aren't aliens but neighbors, we somehow missed for thousands of years. Can you at least tell me, is she alive? Healthy? Reeves softened slightly. Yes, she's alive. She's well. She's still matriarch. still teaching the younger ones, still surviving in territory she's occupied for decades. That's all I can tell you. But Dr. Whitaker, she's going to be fine. Better than fine. Because what you documented, what you protected, is being taken seriously at the highest levels. They'll get protections beyond anything we've ever given any species. Because they're not a species. They're a people. I left Minneapolis with more questions than answers, but at least one certainty. She was alive. The work had succeeded. 22 years of careful observation had protected her long enough for proper frameworks to be established. That had to be enough. December 2024. I received a package. No return address. Inside, a USB drive and a handwritten note from Dr. Morrison. Dr. Whitaker, this is the last communication I can risk. I'm violating protocol sending this, but you deserve closure. The drive contains final footage, taken last week. It's her. She's well. She's thriving. And she's aware that we're protecting her territory. We think she understands in whatever way she processes such things, that humans have stopped being threat and become something else. Not friends, but not enemies. Neighbors with boundaries. That's because of you. Thank you. Destroy this after viewing. CM. I watched the footage that night. 6 minutes. Her in the clearing I'd visited one last time in April 2023. The fallen log. The filtered sunlight. The territory she'd claimed as home. She was older. Gray visible around her muzzle. Movement slightly slower, but healthy. Alert. In her element. And at the end of the footage she did something extraordinary. She looked directly at the camera, positioned where she knew cameras were positioned after months of observation, and placed a stone, deliberately, carefully, in a specific pattern I recognized from my documentation, the same pattern I'd found in 2009, the same pattern I'd noted in 2015, the same pattern that had appeared near my observation points across 20 years. Communication, consistent across decades. She'd been responding to my presence the entire time, acknowledging me, saying, I know you're there, it's okay. And now she was saying it to the cameras, to whoever was watching. I know you're there, it's okay. Not submission, not aggression, just acknowledgement. Coexistence. The same agreement she'd maintained with me, now extended to the larger human presence protecting her territory. I wept watching that footage, because it was goodbye, because it was thank you. Because after 22 years of wondering if the relationship was one-sided, I had confirmation. She'd been as aware of me as I was of her. We'd shared space, respected boundaries, built something that wasn't quite friendship, but was definitely connection. And now it was over. I destroyed the USB drive as instructed, wiped it, physically broke it, ensuring no trace remained that Dr. Morrison had violated protocols to give me closure. Then I filed my retirement paperwork with the Michigan DNR, effective January 2025. 23 years of service. Time to step away. My supervisor asked why. You've got years left, Marcus. Why quit now? Because the work I cared about is finished. She's protected. The population is stable. What else is there? Other research, other species, other projects. But there weren't. Not for me. 22 years had been devoted to one individual. One relationship, one effort at understanding something extraordinary. Everything else would feel hollow by comparison. I'm 68 now, retired, living in Marquette. I still follow the news, still watch for information about the closure zone, still hope for eventual public disclosure when the world is ready to understand that intelligence takes forms we didn't expect, and that people aren't defined by species. Maybe in my lifetime, maybe not, but I know. I witnessed. I documented. And for 22 years I protected something precious by choosing observation over exploitation, distance over contact, respect over possession. That's enough legacy for one life. I visit the closure boundary sometimes. Can't enter. Won't even try. The security is absolute now, and I respect what they're protecting too much to risk disrupting it. But I drive to the perimeter, stand at the fence line, look into forest I knew better than anyone alive. She's in there somewhere. Still teaching, still surviving. Still being the matriarch of a population so small that losing her would be devastating. But that's thriving specifically because humans finally learned to leave them alone. The closure has held for nearly 2 years now. Political pressure to reopen has faded. After the initial controversy, people accepted that some areas need to remain restricted. The economic impact was smaller than predicted. Tourism adjusted. Logging companies found alternative harvest areas. Life adapted, the way it always does when we allow it to. I think about the broader implications constantly. What I tracked for 22 years has fundamentally changed how we understand intelligence, personhood, and our responsibility to non-human minds. There are discussions happening, classified, beyond my access, about legal frameworks. Do they have rights? Sovereignty? Can they own territory? Are they citizens of the states they inhabit? Nations unto themselves? Questions without precedent, because we've never encountered intelligent non-humans who aren't aliens from space but natives of Earth we somehow missed. The indigenous communities have been brought into discussions. Many aren't surprised. Their oral histories described something matching these beings for generations. Brother wolf who walks upright. Forest people, the old ones who remember. Different names, same concept. Intelligent canids who've shared this landscape longer than European humans have been here. Those communities are advocating for sovereignty recognition, arguing these beings should be treated as nations with territorial rights, not species requiring management. It's a radical framework shift, from conservation to diplomacy. I hope they succeed, because management implies human control. Diplomacy implies respect between equals. She deserves respect, not management. I've been contacted by researchers occasionally, people studying the ethics of first contact, the legal frameworks for non-human rights, the protocols for diplomatic relationship with species we've historically treated as wildlife. They want to understand my methodology, how I observed for 22 years without causing stress, how I built relationship, if that's the right word, without violating boundaries, how I knew when to stay back and when stepping closer was acceptable. I tell them the same thing every time. She taught me. Every time I pushed too close, she'd relocate. Every time I respected distance, she'd tolerate continued observation. It wasn't me being brilliant. It was me being attentive to her communication. She set the boundaries. I just learned to read them. That's the key insight. They're not passive subjects. They're active participants in any relationship with humans. They assess, they respond. They make choices about engagement level. Treating them as wildlife would fail. Treating them as people with agency succeeds. I wonder about her legacy, the younger individuals she's teaching. Will they remember her methods, her caution, her ability to navigate a world shared with humans by maintaining specific boundaries and expectations? Or will new generations, growing up under federal protection, become less cautious, more visible, more willing to engage with humans because they've never experienced threat? That's the challenge of successful protection. It changes behavioral patterns. The very caution that kept them hidden for thousands of years becomes unnecessary when humans are no longer threat. But the world changes. Administrations change. Priorities shift. What if future political leadership decides protection is too expensive, that the economic value of opening those 47,000 square miles outweighs conservation benefits? Then the lessons she taught, stay hidden, stay careful, avoid humans, become critical again. And the population's survival might depend on retaining that cultural knowledge even when current conditions don't require it. She's teaching them to survive us. That's her legacy, and it's the most important thing she can pass forward. I have no regrets about how I conducted the research. 22 years of distance observation, never attempting capture, never pushing for closer contact than she allowed, always prioritizing her comfort over my curiosity. Some colleagues think I was too cautious. That closer study would have revealed more, that I wasted opportunities by maintaining excessive distance. But those colleagues don't understand. The goal was never comprehensive study. It was coexistence, demonstrating that humans could occupy adjacent space to intelligent non-humans without either side requiring the other's absence. I proved that's possible. She tolerated human presence, mine, for 22 years. Learned I wasn't threat. Adjusted her behavior to accommodate my predictable patterns while maintaining her own freedom and autonomy. That's the model. That's what needs to be replicated at species level. Humans and her kind sharing landscape, maintaining boundaries, respecting each other's space and needs. If we can't manage that, if we insist on total access, comprehensive study, full understanding, then we'll lose them. They'll retreat further. Population will decline, and eventually they'll follow every other megafauna species we've driven to extinction through proximity and pressure. My 22 years proved it doesn't have to be that way. Coexistence is possible, but it requires restraint. I'll die without knowing the complete story, without understanding their full language, without seeing their entire social structure, without answers to hundreds of questions that remain unresolved. And I'm okay with that, because some questions don't need human answers. Some mysteries are valuable specifically because they remain mysterious. Some beings deserve privacy more than we deserve knowledge. She lived her life, raised young, survived against odds, became matriarch, taught the next generation, did it all in a world shared with humans but not dominated by human need to know everything. That's enough story. That's complete. I visit the fence line today, December 10th, 2025. 23 years since I first found her tracks in Gogabik County. 2 years since I was cut off from even remote observation. 1 year since I retired and stepped away entirely. I stand at the fence and look into forest I'll never walk again, and I say quietly, though no one can hear, thank you, for 22 years of tolerance, for teaching me that intelligence wears many forms, for showing me that sharing space doesn't require understanding, just respect. I hope you're well. I hope you're still teaching. I hope the young ones remember everything you've shown them. I hope your people survive us. And I hope, somehow, you knew that at least one human was trying to protect rather than possess. The forest is silent, as it should be, as it always has been, and somewhere in that silence she survives.